So welcome everybody from coast to coast. This is Susan Samuel. I'm dialing in from Calgary. We have several people in the room here. It's our pleasure to present to you the Canadian Child Health Clinician Scientist Program CCHCSP National Webinar. This is the second webinar this year, and it is going to cover the topic of Indigenous child health research. We are really honored to have two distinguished researchers in this area from the University of Manitoba, Dr. Allison, a pediatric nephrologist, and Dr. Brandy Wicklow, a pediatric endocrinologist, together with their team DREAM Research Group at the Children's Hospital Research Institute of Manitoba, will be presenting to us their learnings from their work with Indigenous youth in particular regarding type 2 diabetes, but there will be learnings for all of us as we work with this vulnerable population across the country. I thank everyone for their attendance, and if the Manitoba team is ready, we will hand over to them. I ask everyone to hold their questions till the end. And if you can type in the questions into the chat box, and when they are coming up, and then Linda can mind the chat box. I'm sorry if anyone is having technology issues. If you're having technology issues, please do contact us through the chat box on Skype. And I'm just going to ask the Manitoba team if they are ready to go.
We are, yeah. So thank you for inviting us. This will be the first for both myself and Allison. I'm not sure if you can see me. I suspect you might be able to because I'm right in front of the computer. And then Allison will come and sit here and present some of the work we did with iCare. So hopefully this runs relatively smoothly. We do have Christy Whitmire at our site as well on my laptop trying to do the comments and questions. So hopefully that works as well. And I think you can send them as we go along, and hopefully she'll receive them, and we'll let you know if there's any problems there. So first and foremost, of course, is traditional land acknowledgement. So we are on Treaty 1 territory here in Manitoba. It is where our population of Indigenous families, friends, and patients live. So it's here in Manitoba, the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji, Cree, Dakota, and Dene people, and home of the Métis First Nations. But we would like to, knowing that this is Canadian-wide, respect the 11 treaties that were made across our continent. And so we appreciate the opportunity to share with you our experiences with our iCare cohort study. It is a majorly Indigenous cohort of youth with type 2 diabetes. But our disclaimer really is that Allison and I aren't Indigenous scholars, and we aren't experts in Indigenous research methodology or ways of knowing. And so what we're sharing with you is really a reflection of the last 5 years of our own education and how we've learned about Indigenous ways of knowing, Indigenous health systems, and some of the barriers to health and to research with Indigenous populations that we've learned in partnership with the different communities that we work closely with. I just got logged out, Lisa. That we work closely with respect to development of our research protocols, all the way through to knowledge translation to communities, and what they would find as important in terms of feedback from our research. So our objectives today really are to review the current landscape of Indigenous child health in Canada. I'm not going to spend a huge proportion of time doing this, and please understand that I'm not going to go over all Indigenous child health, but really focus on the conditions that myself and Allison work with, which is diabetes. So I'm a pediatric endocrinologist and do type 2 diabetes in the province. Allison is a pediatric nephrologist and does kidney disease, and so that's really the focus of the the Indigenous Child Health slouch that we'll introduce you to. And then, importantly, the concepts of working with Indigenous populations before we jump into our own engagement with the communities and the patients and their families. And so I will do some of that in terms of our own learnings, and Allison will then talk to you more specifically about our study. So the prevalence of diagnosed chronic health conditions in First Nations youth, this comes from the Regional Health Survey. So phase 3 of the Regional Health Survey was put out as a report in 2018. It's actually an excellent report, and you'll see here that I've put the link to the downloadable version. It's a survey that covers a huge proportion, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in the next few slides, but a huge proportion of community-based or community-dwelling First Nations populations, so reserves, that have historically been absent or minus from our Statistical Canada databases and all of the health reports that are put out by StatsCan. So these are chronic health conditions in First Nations youth. So you'll see that more than a quarter of Indigenous children, and so children for their reports are 0 to 11 years of age, and about a third of youth, so 12 to 17 years of age, have one or more chronic health conditions living in community or on reserve. They note that this is an improvement over the RHS phase 2, so the original or the second phase of the Regional Health Survey, where about 1/3 across the board had one or more reported health conditions. So although it's still astonishing, the health conditions appear to be improving over time for our Indigenous children and youth. Allergies and asthma remain the #1 chronic health condition across all 3 phases of the RHS, and that is a direct reflection of some of the housing crisis, the mold, the water crisis, and the exposure to smoke that children in First Nations Reserve experience, more so than non-First Nations children and children that don't live on First Nations communities. About a third of First Nations children, or 34.8%, are diagnosed with anxiety and mood disorders, and a third of those with learning disorders, and only about a third of those children who have diagnosed conditions are actually receiving treatment for those conditions. And so it bodes to the mental health component of engagement, the mental health component of our own research study. Even though mental health is not the chronic condition that we study, it certainly is an important part of probably all chronic health disease research that you do with First Nations children and in the populations. In phase 3, they also talk about a higher proportion of female adult First Nations individuals living with one or more chronic illnesses compared to male First Nations adults. It's different in children, so the male children seem to be disproportionately affected by chronic disease and illness, and so certainly SCIHR has requested us to put a sex and gender slant on most of our analysis and most of our research goals. We can see actually in communities that there's a distinct difference between the impact of different health and environmental exposures and sex and gender in the communities. And so we are looking at our own research results in terms of their impacts on males and female children separately in the future. So more specifically, when we talk about, sorry, I'm trying to work 2 computers. More specifically, when we talk about type 2 diabetes in children in Canada, so Shazana Med did a Canadian pediatric surveillance study back. It was dated to 2006, published in 2010, and it looked at across Canada, what did children with type 2 diabetes look like? And this really is just the sort of the ethnic breakdown of children. You can see that in Canada, the majority of children with type 2 diabetes being diagnosed are Indigenous. It's the 3rd largest category in the United States, so non-Hispanic, Black, and Black people are the minority populations in the United States who harbor the biggest burden of type 2 diabetes in that country. Specifically in Manitoba, so myself being a pediatric endocrinologist and a clinician that works with children with type 2, this comes from data from our own clinical experience. So we are the only provincial subspecialty clinic for type 2 diabetes in children in the province. So we capture probably about 80% of children with type 2 diabetes. So this isn't everybody, but certainly the majority. And you can see it's a comparison between rates over time since 1990 to 2016 of type 1 and type 2. And clearly the type 2 prevalence is much higher than type 1, but it wasn't back in 2006 when I had started my endocrinology training. We were looking at about 12.5 per 100,000 population. And I have to use these buttons. And then about last year, when I started doing my own type 2 clinics, we're looking at that rate doubling to about 26 per 100,000 population. So over the last decade, we have had a doubling in the incident rates or new cases of type 2 diabetes in children being diagnosed in our province of Manitoba. And that's all comers. So the denominator of these incidence rates are all children in Manitoba. But if you look at our clinical population being about 90% Indigenous, and you take the baseline population denominator of Indigenous children in our province, knowing that that's not a perfect count, right? So these are normally people who declare status, and that's how they're in the counts of things in terms of demographics. But if you look at that, we're looking at the highest rates in the world. So 95 per 100,000 youth in our province being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And when we look at how these children fare, they don't fare well. And I don't want to belabor this point, but the truth of outcomes is quite astonishing. And so, you know, if we can focus sort of on the right side of the screen, and I don't know if you can see my pointer, but Allison being a pediatric nephrologist and me being a diabetes physician and researcher, we focused really on the rates of nephropathy, and then this bottom, which includes dialysis. And so these are years since diagnosis. So this is 0, and where you can see the rates really plummet and stay is 20 years post-diagnosis. And if I tell you that the average age of children, in my clinic is about 10 to 12 years of age, we're talking about people in their 30s. So people in their 30s have developed end-stage renal failure and are on dialysis. At about 50% of the population that's being diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in childhood. And it's about a 4-fold difference from what we're seeing for people diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in childhood. So certainly type 2 diabetes isn't sort of a touch of diabetes, a bit of diabetes, a lifestyle manageable disease, in particular in the context of children. These children actually end up with very high rates of complications because of their type 2 diabetes, and that really fed into the need to study diabetes in children, and particularly because the population of children we saw clinically were Indigenous, diabetes in children in our Indigenous population. DREAM stands for Diabetes Research Envisioned and Accomplished in Manitoba. And so all of that background really fed into this gathering or grouping of people who are looking at the mechanisms behind why children develop type 2 diabetes, the mechanisms behind why children develop complications at early and high rates when they have type 2 diabetes, and whether or not there are specific interventions that we can put in place to try and change this trajectory or this pathway of health. And so it really started off in 3 different categories. So we looked at complications, which would include renal complications, and that's some of the study we'll talk to you about today. Interventions, we won't talk a lot about these, but these are more from a DOHAD perspective, looking at early infant feeding and breastfeeding, and some of the other work has actually looked at things like early screening and getting early access to healthcare that we've been involved in terms of screening projects. So there's projects across the spectrum of DREAM that have looked at these different arms. Here you'll see a picture of the group, and so we are fortunate to have elders who have been a part of our group since the beginning, and really sort of a strong steering committee that includes Indigenous knowledge keepers and stakeholders. It includes government and policymakers. It includes people who are affected and have lived experience with type 2 diabetes. It includes community health nurses, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, so people who sort of are on the front line and are working with our families and our patients on a day-to-day basis from the different communities. And we try and incorporate all those voices and feedback what we're finding to help us with the direction of our research and with the direction of our study in the future. And so really our steering committee and our patient and family engagement is probably the most important and the central part of how we come up with the different questions. And we have sort of a basic science group that's looking at basic science mechanistic studies. We have our clinical group, which is looking at the clinical well-being and outcomes of our children that we see with diabetes in clinic. And we also have policymakers looking at sort of broader global environmental educational impacts in terms of this particular chronic illness in our communities. And so a little bit more about the First Nations Regional Health Survey. So it started in 1997, the First Nations Regional Health Survey, and it was really the first survey that was led, established, and completed with First Nations governments, with Indigenous people. So this is an Indigenous-led health survey that is published within the governance of an Indigenous organization, and it really is the first thing that worked towards OCAP principles that Allison will talk about in terms of ownership, data, interpretation, protection, all within sort of the First Nations community and a First Nations governments. It's an excellent excellent read, all of them are, and I have the link on the next slide to actually the most recent publication or report from them, which is from 2018. So the First Nations Information Government Center is who ran this survey. So it's a non-for-profit First Nations organization. It's federally incorporated into the Canada's Incorporation Act in 2010, and it operates on a mandate from the Assembly of First Nations across Canada. So in terms of the Canadian First Nations communities, they noticed that they were absent from all the StatsCan data. So that denominator that I told you about, a lot of those things don't include data that has been collected on First Nations reserves. And so most of what you'll see in terms of StatsCan data comes from urban dwelling Indigenous people. And because most of that data was absent, and because there was a large gap then in knowing about chronic health conditions and how to approach them in terms of health promotion of these communities, they came together and formed a group to do this on their own. There are 3 different phases of this. So 1997 was the pilot. Phase 1 was 2002 to 2003, and phase 2 was 2008 to 2010. And then this First Nations Regional Health Survey, Phase 3, was just put out in 2018. This is volume 1, so there are 2 volumes of this. The specific importance about this volume is that it includes children and youth. So it talks about their experiences at school. It talks about their experiences with racism, with bullying, with family functioning, with their parents in terms of maternal habits and family lifestyle habits. It's focused on wellness as opposed to chronic illness. So it looks for enablers of wealth or enablers of health in communities. It encompasses a huge amount of people. So it's almost 24,000 individuals in 263 communities, First Nation communities across Canada. And it really interprets health and wellness in the context of individual, family, community, and culture. So specifically, it says that this regional health survey is built upon wellness, which encompasses Indigenous knowledge, culture, language, and its worldview, as well as spirituality as indicators of health. The indicators are core to an understanding of how Indigenous people balance themselves and are therefore healthy, and it reinforces this type of framework in any research within Indigenous communities and with Indigenous people. It includes specifically the impact of residential schools, life balance, so physical balance, emotional balance, and spiritual balance in its questionnaires and surveys to youth. In emotional well-being, so the impact of depression, emotional and behavioral issues, and a sense of belonging. So it talks a lot about sense of belonging to community, community ceremony, living off the land, the opportunities to go out and learn land-based medicine. And so all of these things being important in sort of a holistic view of First Nations health, which we then as clinicians in a more Western view and model of chronic illness have tried to incorporate into our own research studies. And we'll talk to you a bit about that in a minute. The other thing really that me and Allison have done to try and educate ourselves in terms of our overall working with First Nations communities and First Nations people is to look at the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action, and specifically those that impact health and health research. And so you can see number 18 really is acknowledgement that the poor health is the result of some of the governmental policies, including colonization and residential schools, which really have a lasting impact on the health of the children and the families in these communities, as well as health in the communities in a whole. Reconciliation really comes along the line of implementing healthcare rights in terms of equity, inclusion, and culturally safe care, and that's things that we're trying to work on in terms of our own clinical approach to children here in Winnipeg, but also in terms of our research. To recognize gaps in health outcome is one of the calls to reconciliation and to truth. And so this has to do with some of the reporting of stats that we've done in terms of these rates of outcomes for children with type 2 diabetes. Although devastating to hear, it calls to a gap in the healthcare disparity of our Indigenous youth, and then for action in terms of incorporating novel ways to treat children. What's not here is 20 and 21. So 20 is the unique health needs of off-reserve living Indigenous individuals, and 21 is sustainable funding for initiating and maintaining Indigenous-run wellness centers and Indigenous healing, which incorporates traditional healing. But 22 really also calls upon us in terms of healthcare providers, which I think if you look at the lifelong learning environment includes people in research, you know, as we're all part of health, to recognize that they have their own healing practices and traditional ways of practicing, and how we can incorporate those not only in clinic, but in our own research studies. The next slide that I'm showing you really is a depiction of the social determinants of Indigenous people's health from the National Collaborating Center for Aboriginal People's Health. So this is Delu and Greenwood's Web of Being. I've taken it from Marnie Brownwell and Nathan Nichols' report of a family's first initiative looking at home visits within First Nations communities and how that impacts health, family bonding, wellness, and culture. But it really goes to speak about sort of the proximal to the distal impactors of health, the proximal impactors having direct impacts on physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual health, and include things like employment, income, and education. But as you move out, the secondary determinants like community infrastructure, ability to have sports and recreation, cultural continuity, and the healthcare systems that provide healthcare within communities are sort of more proximal. And then more distal really talk about colonialism, racism, poverty, so the bigger impacts. And clearly this just tells you that the history of Aboriginal or Indigenous people in our country have been impacted by some of these governmental policies, and the loss of land, culture, language, early life stressors, and residential schools continue to impact outcomes in terms of chronic health illness like the diabetes that we are studying. So this is a picture of some of the communities that we go to. So Garden Lake and St. Teresa Point and Garden Hill in the Island Lake region. So they're remote, they're fly in, there's winter roads, or you have to boat across. So it's difficult in terms of subspecialty care or other allied health care. And this really speaks to, and I won't speak long to this, this really speaks to in particular that there are publications that have looked at the impact of residential schools on biologic and physiologic outcomes, which include diabetes and include obesity. And so this is one that came out recently in CMHA, and it really points to undernutrition of children in residential schools and how that impacts then adiposity, risk for obesity, and things like type 2 diabetes as young adults, and the intergenerational approach of that. This one here is also an excellent review, which really just talks about the impacts of mental health, but also of things like obesity, metabolic disease, and chronic cardiac disease, not only in residential school survivors, but in their offspring. And so in the children who are impacted in this sort of intergenerational way. Finally, I just want to speak quickly about this last slide. It talks about enablers of health. So as part of our learning, we've learned that, in terms of looking at resilience and strength-based approaches to doing research in Indigenous populations and with Indigenous children, we can switch our focus from all of the barriers to health to what we can really do to help the children and the communities in terms of these healthcare issues. And so this comes from the report on Indigenous children and youth from Health Canada, and so the profile is here. It's module 7, based on health, but it's a determinants of health model. So structural talks about global governmental policies in terms of self-governance, regulation, jurisdiction of health. Systemic enablers talk about education and health programming, like the Head Start, like Indigenous language programming in the schools. Family enablers talk about parental age and parity and income. And then family enablers also talk about sort of family-based learning, cultural practices at the home, traditional healing methods. So there are some other resources out there that talk about sort of strength-based or resilience approaches, which we have also attempted to incorporate within our own research that Allison will talk about. So.
Okay, thanks very much, Brandy. So I'm going to really start talking more about our own research, but before I get to that, I thought it would be important just to highlight a few guiding principles when anyone is embarking on research that involves Indigenous people. And of course, OCAP principles should be well known to everyone on this webinar, but I just actually completed the OCAP training module that was put out by the FNIGC, and I actually learned some things when I read through that, and I would encourage anyone interested in Indigenous health research to take this training. And I just want to mention that the OCAP principles actually stemmed from the steering committee that led the longitudinal regional health survey back in the 90s, and I wasn't aware of that. And initially, actually, there were only 3 guiding principles, the OCA, which really resonated with the OCA crisis back in the early 90s. And this stemmed from the concept that First Nation people understand the importance of community, of respect, and of the need to protect their resources for future generations. And in the context of research, that resource is really information. And so that concept really needs to apply there as well. So they don't just focus on numbers and statistics, it's more broad for them. It's culture, it's identity, it's traditions and self-determination. So all these things are interwoven through all of the research studies that are done on their people. And so ownership really relates to that connection that First Nation people have to community, to their data, both individually and collectively. Control really speaks to the need for Indigenous people to really dictate how things are collected in their communities, how the data is used, by whom and under what conditions. Access speaks to the right to determine access regardless of where the data is held. And possession, which was added later and really is the critical one, which gives First Nation people the power to actually implement the first 3. And so they really need to be able to ensure that they can dictate any research such that it has benefit to their community and not any detrimental effects. So you can become OCAP certified now with this training, and the FNIGC is actually, their mission is to uphold the values of OCAP, and they're discussing a process to actually ensure that studies become OCAP certified. So if Indigenous research meets all the criteria, then it could be classified as OCAP certified, and this may become something that's required in the future for any study. The other important resource, of course, is the TCPS Chapter 9 or Module 9, which is more of an ethical framework for research that is involves Indigenous people, and it really has three core principles that acknowledge the unique status of Indigenous people in Canada. And the first one is the respect for person, which means to honor every individual's and community's capacity and autonomy to make free and informed decisions, including the freedom not to participate in research. And it acknowledges that Aboriginal cultures and identities are distinct from other perspectives, and that they need to include responsibilities to the natural world, knowledge received from ancestors and future generations. Concern for welfare refers to the interests of the individual, and this is balanced with the care of participants' physical, social, economic, and cultural environments. And finally, the concept of justice concerns the balance of power between researchers and participants. And it really speaks to the potential for communities to be taken advantage of potentially by research, and the importance of fairness and equity, and really the need to engage with communities at the beginning of any research project so that their needs are met and nobody is taking advantage of them. What the involvement of the community looks like is really up to the community, and there can be quite a spectrum. Many communities really want to be equal participants, which would be a high level of engagement. Some are happy just to have strengthening in their community by research capacity. Others are just happy to be recognized that they're participating in the research, but they all want to have return of the results. They need that feedback loop of what the findings are so that people aren't coming in, doing the research, publishing it potentially, and that's it, and they don't actually get any benefit from that. Whereas other communities may be happy just to monitor the research, be aware that it's going on, be accepting of it, think it's helpful, but not necessarily be active involved. So it's really up to the community to decide that. So I'll now shift to iCare, which stands for Improving Renal Complications in Adolescents with Type 2 Diabetes through Research. And this is a national study that was originally funded here in Manitoba and is now expanded to 8 other sites across Canada. And we are planning to recruit 400 children with type 2 diabetes across the country. As Brandy already mentioned, the highest rates are here in Manitoba, so much of the cohort will come from Manitoba and Northwestern Ontario, because we do follow children from that area of the country as well. And we're now in the active phase of enrolling children at the other centers as well. We have quite a holistic model that we're looking at in this study. Our outcome is early onset kidney disease, so albuminuria, and we're evaluating a biopsychosocial model, so biological exposures, psychological exposures, as well as a number of social factors that may impact on those biological and psychological outcomes. And our theoretical framework is that the biological and psychological effects interact through inflammation in the body. So we're measuring a number of inflammatory markers, cytokines as well, and all of them together impact on early kidney disease. So our current areas of focus are, of course, renal, because the children, that's the most common complication. And we're also including a number of psychological measures, as well as cardiovascular measures like 24-hour blood pressure, carotid intermedial thickness, and LVH as early markers of end organ cardiovascular damage, as well as studying more broadly some key social determinants and the impacts potentially of social and environmental stressors on epigenetics, and there's a DOHAD component to the study as well. So just to show you some early findings, we've recruited now almost 270 individuals into the study. This is data from the first 260. And I'm reporting our Winnipeg site and the national site separately. You can see that we have some work to do on the national site front, and that's an active area that is improving with time. But there are many similarities in the children from our site to the others with respect to age, the fact that females predominate in the type 2 diabetes cohort. Ethnicity, however, is quite different. Our cohort is 93% First Nation, whereas the reason to enroll children from other sites was to look at variability by ethnicity to see if the outcomes that we're seeing in the Indigenous population are also happening in non-Indigenous children as well. Of course, many of our children do come from low-income families, and many of them come from remote communities, which is quite different at the national site level, so we can look at differences in these social factors on outcomes. We started to ask in the last kind of year, what are some challenges that the children really perceive in their community, as well as some of the strengths that we can potentially build upon. You can see that the children have a lot of competing demands, stresses around alcohol and drugs, lack of education, and even gang activity in the communities, whereas some positive things are family values, social connections, traditional ceremony, and so these are things that we could potentially help support to help build their resilience and potentially help them with their diabetes self-management. Unfortunately, right now, their glycemic control is really not optimal, and that speaks to all of the challenges that they do face. And our site does seem to be higher risk in that regard than the other sites so far. We've started to collect a number of mental health measures on the children as well, because as I'll introduce to you, our advisory group has really spoken about the importance of mental health in their day-to-day lives. And K6 distress score is a measure of depression and anxiety, and these scores are about double what you would see in the Canadian Community Health Survey. So really significant issues with mental health, high levels of stress. However, as we're also measuring measures of resiliency, we're finding real strengths in individual resiliency that we can also build upon. About 30% of our cohort across the board does have evidence of early kidney disease, which is of course a concern. And so as we continue recruitment, we'll start to analyze what the most relevant risk factors are. And then our next step will hopefully be to develop an intervention study. I now want to introduce to our patient advisory group. As we were getting our grant together for CIHR, it was around the time that SPORE came about, and although engagement with Indigenous populations has gone for a long time, the rest of the world is sort of catching up with the concept of patient engagement, and so we really realized that we needed to not only have a stakeholder advisory group, but also a patient advisory group to learn from them what those important social factors were that we needed to be including to the study. So we recruited patients and families from the clinic that we already had connections with, and this is a picture from actually the training day that we did with them about 1 year ago, and you can see that there's a broad range of ages and a broad range of team members as well here, and so we were learning together about how to work with patient partners in this context. So we really just started our advisory group by having a conversation with them. We were a little bit intimidated at first about how to do this, so we just decided to try it and see how it went. And so we really just started a conversation about what it was like for them to live with type 2 diabetes. And while our study focused on kidney outcomes, it became clear the first day we met them that they had other priorities, and that their kidney health was really low on the list. They really identified some key themes that I've listed here on this slide that were really more relevant and important to them. The issue of blame and shame, stress, mental health, the difficulty with self-care, the importance of supports and the lack of supports in certain circumstances, and really the impact of systemic issues that they were facing, all of the things that Brandy has already highlighted. So these are the things that we've been trying to incorporate into our study, which is focused on kidney outcomes, but we're really trying to be more holistic and include all of these things, which are of course the things that actually are meaningful to the kids. This is just a slide to show, some of the things that we worked through with them. We made this rainbow of different layers of support, and all of the kids worked through, what are those family supports or school supports, community or society, issues that are relevant to them. And I know you can't read this, but it's just to show how the brainstorming kind of took place. It was really just having a conversation and working through things with them that really helped to set the different measures that we are including in the study. This is also probably too small for you to read, but it's a timeline with our advisory group. We actually started back in 2015, so we've known them for 3 years, and we've been meeting with them regularly since then. We've had some members come and go. Many of the youth, of course, have turned 18 or older, and they now are going to university and have other priorities, but we've been trying to bring in new members as we go so that we always have a core group of members to work with us on the study. And really, some key things just to highlight is that we have tried to involve our advisory group more broadly with the Council of CKD SPORE Network, which is the one that we are most heavily involved with. We have done the patient training, which was modified from the SPORE modules to our group by our SPORE support unit, which was really well received and really, really helpful. The kids chose to work on a video as their first initiative, which I've included the link at the end. I'm not sure we'll have time to show that today, but really that blame and shame was something that really came out as being a really strong issue for them and something that needed to be addressed in clinical care as well as more broadly in the community. And then I'll show you a number of outputs that we've produced with the group over time. We've also started to bring an elder into our clinic based on the issue of support and the importance of traditional cultural support. And so we have had an elder coming to our clinic for the last 6 months, which has been a really positive change. And we're trying to do a sharing circle at the beginning of every clinic so that we're decreasing the power differential between the care providers and the kids in the clinic. We've really seen improvements in communication with that. They're also working on a booklet to teach other children about what it's like to live with type 2 diabetes. And some of our kids aren't really that chatty in our meetings, but they have other ways of communicating. And this one youth actually spent some time making a cartoon about how she felt about living with type 2 diabetes. And a lot of them are really good artists. And so we've tried to incorporate their voice in different ways with their art and their talents. We've been working on some knowledge translation tools with them to just share our findings to kids and community in ways that they might understand. And this is an example of how we might disseminate our results of the importance of physical and mental health through inflammation to the protein in the urine. Nobody can say albuminuria, so we've trying to change the language to something more important to them. They've helped us with advertisements for the study as well as for the advisory group. We've tried to collect some of their stories as well from, this is Jackie McKee, she's our current chair of our advisory committee. She's been really great all the way through being a strong advocate for her son who lives with type 2 diabetes and really passionate about being involved in the group, and she's been involved in a lot of our KT tools, and this is an example of a poster that we've put together to help with recruitment into the advisory group. We had a knowledge exchange broker that worked with us for a while, and she put together some blogs. This is Shayna. She is one of the youth members of our group, and she did an interview with her about her experiences. Again, there's Jackie and Brandy sharing their experiences with the advisory group, and then we've also had some media opportunities, which has been another great way to share what we're doing. Jackie also led the publication of her perspective in a recent diabetes communicator publication, and we're putting together the themes from our first advisory group for a publication, hopefully in CMAJ Open with the new patient engagement articles that they're now accepting. So we certainly had some challenges with the group. Our patients come from all over the province, and so we have been bringing in kids that do live a driving distance away, but we're really hoping to develop some satellite advisory groups in more remote communities so that we can get their perspective as well. Of course, school and work are ongoing challenges, and so we've had, again, differing numbers of people at our meetings from time to time. So we're just trying to work with what works for them. Compensation has been something that has come up, and we can maybe talk about that more, but we really feel it's important to compensate the patients and families so that we're acknowledging the time that they are giving us. We're exploring weekend and evening meetings. One of the other sites is giving school credit to youth to participate, and that's something that might be an option in some places as well. This is just a slide to give you some resources that you could pursue on your own as far as gaining cultural sense of safety training, the OCAP training. Also, we recently participated in a Kairos blanket exercise, which is a really powerful, oops, this title's wrong there, sorry about that, a really powerful interactive session that takes you through all of the different historical steps that Indigenous people have experienced and really gives you a perspective that is more powerful than anything you can read. And so I would suggest, if anyone has the opportunity to participate in that, to please take the opportunity. Finally, I just wanted to mention this training module, which is really meant to be module 4 of this 4-patient training that's being currently developed in collaboration, the Cancer CKD Network and the Diabetes Action Canada SPOR Network, as well as some other partners, including hopefully our research group as well here at DREAM, which is really meant to be a learning pathway for researchers that will incorporate things like the Sanyas cultural training, like OCAP training and the Kairos blanket exercise to really give people the tools that they need to work respectfully with Indigenous people. This is my last slide that I'll leave you with, and hopefully we have a few minutes for questions. Just some steps for engagement to consider. Really, the relationships with patients and families and community stakeholders are really the foundation of any work that is done in a meaningful way. Really, a true appreciation of partners as experts in lived experience. And we're still working through the steps of engagement with our group, but I think the first step for us has really been the real understanding of where they're coming from and the ongoing relationship that we're trying to build with them. And we've really gained so much, as far as clinical practice, but also in our research work by spending the time with our group. It's really important to understand the context of Indigenous child health and well-being. The training is very helpful for researchers and patients and families, so I'd strongly encourage that. I believe CCH-CSP is developing some pediatric relevant training materials, which is great. Those were not available when we were trying to do our training. And the Module 4 will be really helpful as well. Always remember the OCAP principles, but first and foremost, be patient. Things take time. You can't expect to be progressing through the stages of a research project at the same pace as you might with other types of studies. And I think that's okay. I think it's just resetting those priorities and understanding the value of taking the time, because in the end, that's really going to pay dividends. So with that, I'll just share the link of the video. Please check it out. If you Google eye care diabetes YouTube, you'll find it as well. It's about 5 minutes, and it's really that story of our patient advisory group that they wanted to tell. So I guess we'll now open it up to questions.
Where they all come from? You, Christy? Wow. It's turned off. Turn it back on at any time. So we're going to assume this works, but it might not. And I don't know, Linda, if you're there, if it doesn't work, if there's an alternate way to ask questions.
So I am here, and it should be working well. I do see it on my screen, and you should be receiving questions shortly.
Nope. Oh, thank you. It's nice that you joined us, Nancy. I know that you do a lot of work in this area yourself, and I have also seen you present, so much appreciated.
Yeah, I'm just trying to open it up.
Of course, yeah. Yeah.
My question was one of them. It was a wonderful presentation. You can listen to talks like this all the time, every time. message I can share with us. Thank you for doing this. The First Nations Regional Health Survey 2018. You said it involved 263 First Nations communities. Were those all reserve communities, or were those all urban, also including in urban communities into the stats?
So it's not typing, so I'll just repeat Dr. Greenberg's question here. So the Regional Health Survey, the phase 3, was 263 First Nations communities. They are, I believe, all reserve communities or First Nations. Now they don't call them reserve lands, they call them First Nations communities. So First Nations communities that are not urban, because that was who was missing. That was the voice that was missing. It was the purpose of the first one.
Where are the urban
But they're
statistics now?
But they're all, except for, I think, and it includes Whitehorse and the Yukon, which have been missing from the previous ones, but does not include Nunavut. So Nunavut's not a part of it. But you'll see, they actually have a list at the end of the survey of every single First Nation community that was involved in the surveys across Canada. So they list them all. Where's the urban Indigenous information coming from?
Is the urban Indigenous information included in this survey? No.
Not as far as I know, not from what I read. So theoretically, urban Indigenous people got captured through Statistics Canada. The problem there was you obviously self-identified as First Nations, or you have been registered through registration and had status, so to speak. And so of course it misses people, and that's always been the issue with also Métis stats, right? Is that they don't have the same status and they're not sort of counted in the same output in terms of urban dwelling people.
Can it come out with a report?
StatsCan has a whole bunch of health reports on Indigenous people in Winnipeg.
2018 as well. I'm not sure how often they.
You know what? I don't know the last one. The last big survey was a long survey, right? It's data from 2006. Still, we stopped doing the long survey, if you'll remember.
The 2018 report obviously gives us a good context of, the whole health and wellness as related to, real living conditions within First Nations communities.
Right.
StatsCan will give us the urban perspective as well.
Right. So the mandate, I'm going to get to this next question from you, Alberta, in a second, but the mandate from this organization is to do this every 4 years. And in the context of truth and reconciliation, the point I think now is to take all of those first phases and say after a certain period of time that this will be the way that we determine whether or not there's been actual action and change based on the TRC. And so they'll go back and do these surveys and look at hard outcomes and
you say it's the First Nations Indigenous Governance Center that is
yes that runs
overseeing all
that oversees the RHF.
Yeah, so they were originally the steering committee and they evolved to become that
and
FNIGC.
Independent.
Yeah. You, Alberta, thanks. A problem for some clinician scientists at the Stollery in trouble getting consent for Indigenous children, as they often do not come with a primary caregiver. Is this something you've experienced, and if so, what has helped in this regard? Yeah, so absolutely. We have a lot of youth that come to clinic not with their legal guardian, so to speak. I think that, we're respectful in terms of there's always the age cutoff. So we'll talk to kids who are, 17 or 18 in terms of assent and having them speak to their legal guardians. We generally don't have children in care necessarily involved because it's tricky, although we have had one or two in long-term care placements who were not legally adopted by new families but had been there forever and had good relationships with their overall services, and so the social worker and the guardian had come together to sign that consent form. We also spend a lot of so the other thing is we go to community. And to be honest with you, I think that that's key. So these families, even if the kids come down with an aunt or an uncle who has a different appointment, I've been to St. Teresa and Garden Hill. I go every year. I go twice a year. And so that's part of this. Relationships are key in knowing families and knowing communities, is that I know who their parents are. And so even if they come with someone else, and oftentimes they have 3 or 4 kids that are involved in the study. So I think it makes a huge difference. And we go to community in terms of research as well. And so we have band council. Obviously, you can't just go to community. We have band council resolutions. We've talked to the chiefs. We've had that relationship built within specific communities in order to do that. But it really helps in terms of engagement and also in terms of enrollment, recruitment, and retention. I mean, we have really great retention. We haven't really lost very many kids at all. I would say about at least 85%. And that's 6 years. And I think that speaks to us knowing these kids and their families and their communities, that they continue to come back and participate. So I don't know if you have the opportunity to go to community, but I found that probably has really benefited us. I don't know if you have other thoughts on that, Allison.
No, I totally agree with
Yeah.
you.
There you go. We've never tried.
We have the odd time done over the phone consent when we can explain the whole consent form to them and then have them sign the form and get it back to us. So we have some families that just aren't able to come to do the actual face-to-face, but we haven't actually considered health, but it's a good option. It might be an easier for them to go over things with them. Okay, we have another question from Linda about working with patients and families is a very iterative process. How has it affected your research timelines? And have you noticed a difference in working with First Nations with respect to patient-oriented research? Well, I have to say my first experience with patient-oriented research has been with our patient advisory groups, so I really don't personally have experience with other populations other than the CanSolve CKD network, which is very different because they have a patient panel that is all adults that are high achieving, people that continue to amaze me, the dedication that they have and the commitment that they have to what they do. So I certainly have noticed a difference in, what our group is doing from what, adults are doing in patient engagement. But I think it's, again, resetting that priority, and we're working with kids. We're trying to help them with their health conditions. So working with the population that you're trying to help is really critical. So we've had kind of tugs to bring in type 1 diabetes patients or other people that may, have more education or things like that. But I think we really held true to our group, and we've really benefited from that. So yes, it has affected our timeline. Sometimes it does take longer, and sometimes people, can't make it and things like that. But I think that's okay. And so I think we just need to stick with what we're doing and just, again, try to meet them where they're coming from.
And we've learned in non-traditional ways. So we have them draw pictures for us to demonstrate feelings, or, and so whereas maybe you could say, can you write down a priority list of research outcomes for this, which we might not get back. We could say, here, here's a bridge from this land to this land. Tell me what will get you across that bridge, or tell me, in terms of just thinking outside the box. And I think we learned that after our first meeting with them, where we said, can you give us priorities? And instead they said, can we make a video? And so, but that's where our learning has stemmed from these kids as well. And so, and the video is quite remarkable, actually. And there's about 5 or 6 different health questions that you could ask directly from that video that weren't put in the form of patient-oriented outcomes per se, but are clearly that's what they are.
The other thing that's really been helpful is just having face-to-face meetings. I know a lot of patient partners do work through webinars or teleconference, and really that hasn't been,
it's been hard to engage that way.
Yeah, and we have set up a Facebook page as well, which has helped with communication, and that really came from our group. They wanted it to be a closed Facebook page, and so we do communicate with them that way. Not all of them have their own phone or have access to, sometimes they're hard to track down, so that's been one way that's really helped to communicate with them. And then they really enjoy the time actually that they get to come and see each other. So I think one of the big benefits for them has been the support that they've gained from seeing other kids or other parents experiencing the same things that they are. They often feel very alone and isolated in their condition. And so that first day was really, I think, therapeutic. It probably helps that our clinical psychologist runs the sessions, and she has a really good way of making a safe space for them that's very respectful, and so they feel comfortable to talk about what they're actually feeling.
I think there's one last question. We're probably going to get cut off soon, but this is, can you expand on how you're capturing and categorizing psychosocial exposures in your study? So in terms of mental health particularly, we have the K6 scale, which looks at stress. And then we also have the,
Sorry, the K6
depression,
is
anxiety, and the PSS is the psychosocial stress scale. So the K6 is 6 items, so it's super quick, 6 questions. And then it's 16, right? It's 14 is 14 questions. And then we were doing a resiliency questionnaire. So it actually, I think, comes from the Circle of Courage idea from Martin Brokenleg, because it has mastery, and so it has the big components of resiliency in terms of mastery over your health, leadership, resiliency. And so it asks things in a positive way in terms of looking at things that would pull on strengths and resilience in terms of a strength-based approach. It's quite long. It's 4 pages, I guess, or it's a page per type, right? Isn't it?
So you're talking, yeah. Then we've done a longer one, and then we've also added this one by Unger, which is a shorter measure.
Right.
So, I mean, we do have a process in place to screen the questionnaires, and we've actually had a lot of kids that have screened positive for alert questions, and that's been one of the challenges in our study is how do we ensure that these kids are getting the follow-up that they need. And so I think anytime you start asking mental health questions, you need to have a system in place to be able to follow up on those things. And our team actually has done some training in how to talk to patients about risks, suicidal risks and things like that. We still struggle with really not having a really great system in our healthcare system to address mental health for these kids, but certainly the ones at highest risk are getting here because they're being asked these questions in the study. So I think that's a benefit to them. And it's really opened the awareness in the clinic. Initially, people were afraid to ask because they didn't want to have to deal with it, but now I think people realize it's actually really important and actually better to ask and know instead of just ignoring the issue that's probably been there for a long time.
Thank you, Allison and Brandy. This has been a wonderful session. We are now at 5 minutes past, so do allow everyone to continue asking the questions and to engage the presenters. We encourage you to contact Linda, and also we can make Allison and Brandy's emails available to our CCHCSB group. I want to give you both and the team in Manitoba our sincere thanks for the very first Indigenous Child Health presentation. And as you already alluded to, we're hoping that CCHCSP will be able to provide training materials for researchers across Canada who are interested in pursuing work similar to yours. So we hope that you'll continue to be engaged with that. And thank you so much for preparing. And for all the attendees across the country, thank you very much for coming and listening and learning. We hope to meet you all in due time. And we're planning further national webinars, and that information will come in due course. So from Linda and myself, thank you very much and have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
Don't forget to complete the evaluations. Thanks again. You can find the link on the flyer.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks.